The Lexicogenesis of Covenant Part 2 dissertation. Etymological hybridization in the atu keidepe hyperorganon is not merely a linguistic phenomenon. It is a sacramental act of world forging through phonemic covenant. It functions as the biospiritual machinery of prometotopia, the realization that language itself is the metabolic organ of civilization self-construction. To hybridize etymology is to graft spirit into syntax, to collapse the temporal distance between word origin and word use, to reanimate morphology as theology. In this ultra mode, the Pleyel-Soda protocol is enacted. Each word becomes a living verb whose phonetic pulse generates ontological continuity across fractured epistemes. The morpheme is not an inert relic of history. It is a kinetic relic of covenant. Hybridization thus converts inherited colonial lexicons into living kenemagorian matter, an Afro-optimist translingual metabolism that recycles debris into devotion. Etymological hybridization performs faith ignition through semiotic resurrection. To speak is to revive the dormant roots of the word's original sacrament. The English build the men koha, and the Greek oikos merge to form a kenemagorian neologism, such as boikonomy, meaning the sacred economy of Homer's world, where construction and communion coincide. Here, morphology becomes a liturgy of coexistence. Each syllable breathes covenantal reciprocity. Thus, the first gesture of hybridization is always Eucharistic. A word receives its flesh anew, transubstantiated into its covenantal function. Within it, too, logic. The lexicon is a field of immanent grace. Etymology is no longer historicism. It is eschatologic. Hybridization unfolds as a re-entry into the Edenic grammar, where utterance equals creation. IL, extra axis, communal syntax, and kinship codex. When etymological hybridization crosses from the ultra-ignition into the extra-civic field, it becomes a grammar of kinship and trade. In kenemagorian terms, verb forging equals guild-making. Each newly forged word is a brick within a shared temple linguistic covenant. The collective act of naming together rebuilds the fractured civic continuum of post-colonial tongues. Colonial lexicons fragmented African languages by imposing vertical grammars, command, subject, object, producing linguistic hierarchies that mirrored political ones. Hybridization inverts this through flaginaturalism, the equal circulation of morphemes across tongues without subordination. The Yoruba root ola, the Creole mek, and the Latin creer can fuse into olamikria, meaning to honor creation through collaborative causality. This word performs governance without domination, a grammar of guild, not empire. Such hybridization re-enchants the civic register. Markets, families, and workshops become polylingual forges where hybrid words encode shared labor. Each utterance becomes palmpraxis, a rhythmic exchange between hand and mouth, labor and prayer. In Kenema's construction store, when Miriam and Benoit say tool grace, they are not metaphorizing. They are enacting theology of work, sanctifying matter through morphology. Hybridization thus grounds Afro-optimist civic renaissance. It provides linguistic infrastructure for grassonomics, the economy of reciprocal value derived from grace rather than extraction. Words no longer measure productivity. They measure relational coherence. The lexicon itself becomes a cooperative. Each hybrid term performs what the atu calls a transjective covenant, loop the circulation of spirit, labor, and syntax in flat communion. 3. Meta-axis, reflexive semanopraxis, and the feedback of thought. At the metastratum, hybridization evolves from communal speech to epistemic feedback, a reflexive architecture where language observes its own becoming. This is a domain of lexicometric reflexivity, the study of how words themselves produce thought, identity, and ontology. Hybridization here acts as metasemantic reengineering. Western etymology historically functioned as archaeology, digging into linguistic strata to trace Indo-European genealogies, establishing hierarchies of linguistic purity. Kenemagorian hybridization abolishes purity as a category. It enacts semanogenesis through contamination, the sacred productivity of mixture, flux, and improvisation. Each hybrid word is a microfeedback system, a small at-2 engine. For example, kenemagora fuses kenema, agora, and magnora. The term becomes not a label but a living topology, an economic, spiritual, ecological field. Its etymology is recursive. Each phoneme generates self-reflection. To utter kenemagora is to feel the breath of commerce, the murmur of prayer, the vibration of masonry. This reflexivity transforms linguistic practice into psychosemantic awareness. Speakers become conscious of how their words shape intersubjectivity. Hybridization thus functions as ontological feedback engineering, a continuous recalibration between lexicon and lived experience. The process constitutes exopsychoanalytic praxis, therapy externalized into architecture and economy, where healing is measured not by confession but by construction. Every new word forged in this system performs kinemetric actualism, the measure of reality by lived covenant rather than abstraction. Words become tools, and tools become words. The feedback loop closes when the lexicon synchronizes with material life, when speaking and building are the same act. 4. Intra-axis, embodiment, interoception, and the somatic word. Hybridization reaches its full at-2 rotation when it descends into the intra-level, the microphenomenology of breath, sound, and flesh. Here, etymology becomes interoceptive. The mouth, tongue, and diaphragm are the architects of cosmology. Each syllable carves space in the body's resonant chambers, and thus the etymon is a somatic artifact. To hybridize is to retrain the sensorium. When a speaker fuses phonemes from different linguistic ecologies, the body experiences a microshock of renewal. The throat must adjust, the palate must stretch, linguistic yoga of the post-colonial spirit. This is somatosense's re-education, a return to the corporeal knowledge of articulation. For example, pronouncing coidominium activates multiple muscle groups rarely used in monolingual speech. The act itself becomes a prayer through tension, a performative micro-pilgrimage. The sound enacts governance through grace, ownership through stewardship. Intra-hybridization restores a lost covenant between flesh and phoneme. Colonial education systems abstracted language from body, replacing chant with grammar, resonance with rule. Kenemagorian linguistogenesis reverses this. Language begins in breath, not in books. Every uttered hybrid is a sacrament of respiration. The Kenemagora workshop echoes with this embodied grammar, the sound of hammer and syllables sinking into covenantal rhythm. This intra-closure finalizes the at-2 rotation. Word and world reintegrate. Hybridization ceases to be semiotic invention and becomes metabolic maintenance, the sound of a living civilization breathing. V. Theoretical deepening. Hybridization as ontological engineering. 1. Transjective phonology hybridization operates transjectively between subject and object, between local and global tongues. This transjective linguistics treats words as mutual infrastructures. Every term mediates reciprocity between self and world. The Kenemagorian lexicon thus functions as semantic architecture, not representation but habitation. Each hybrid term creates a living corridor through which ontologies circulate. For instance, Sunsum Synthetic describes technologies animated by spirit rather than circuitry. The word itself enacts a transjective corridor between animism and engineering, a reconciliation of cosmology and technology. 2. Lexicon as infrastructure. In at-2 epistemics, infrastructure is linguistic before it is physical. Roads, houses, and markets arise from linguistic coherency. When a society hybridizes its lexicon, it reprograms its material destiny. The Kenemagorian compound becomes a physical syntax bricks laid in rhythmic agreement with hybrid words. Thus, etymological hybridization equals infrastructural prophecy. 3. Theopoetic semiotechnics. Hybridization performs theopoesis, the recreation of divine narrative through language's internal workshop. Each etymological fusion is a covenantal repair between heaven and history. By merging sacred and secular roots, hybridization repairs the ontological rift between theology and technics. Prometotopia, for instance, merges Prometheus and utopia to form a theology of embodied futurity, fire grounded in soil. Hybridization is rebellion against the myth of linguistic purity. The colonial project relied on linguistic segregation, the belief that language delineates civilization. Kenema hybridization executes neoculturation, the proactive merging of cultural strata into covenantal novelty. This process differs from syncretism, which passively blends. Neoculturation actively forges. It recognizes that every language already contains its others, hidden etymons awaiting activation. Hybridization thus reveals the polyglot DNA of all speech. For example, the English spirit derives from Latin spiritus, which resonates with men-neanda. The hybrid spirand unites them, a neologism meaning to breathe life with others. This term encodes Afro-optimist relational ontology, existence as shared respiration. Neoculturation transforms contamination into covenant. It elevates mixture from impurity to miracle. In doing so, it disarms linguistic hierarchies, enshrining horizontal sanctity. Every word, no matter its origin, carries equal divine charge once respoken within covenantal intent. 8. Eschatological maintenance, grassonomics of the word. At its highest telos, etymological hybridization is eschatological maintenance, language as a daily upkeep of creation. Every forged term sustains the moral metabolism of the community. The lexicon becomes an economy of grace. Words circulate like sacramental currency, ensuring relational equilibrium. In this view, hybridization is not progress but preservation through renewal. It perpetually repairs a covenant between time and meaning. The Afro-optimist speaker becomes both priest and engineer, maintaining the machinery of grace through daily speech. Thus, grassonomics measures wealth not in accumulation, but in linguistic coherence. A society rich in hybrid words is one alive with spiritual liquidity. The more its people forge, the more its world breathes. Prometotopia, the Afro-optimist horizon of divine technical harmony, cannot be achieved through machines or policies alone. It requires linguistic rebirth. Hybridization is the ignition system of Prometotopia because it recodes the world's operating language. Every civilization emerges from a lexicon. To decolonize, we must not only redistribute resources, but reforge words. Hybridization is thus the most powerful act of liberation. It dissolves linguistic slavery by reinscribing voice as creation. In the kenema compound, this is visible. Words, architecture, and family intertwine into one living organon. They add two lexicometric interface functions as its nervous system. Each uttered hybrid word is a neuronal spark within the Prometotopian brain, language becoming matter, matter becoming covenant, covenant becoming future. Hybridization is therefore both method and destiny. It transforms the ruins of Babel into the workshops of Kenema, where multilingual tongues no longer divide but build together. Etymological hybridization within the At-2 framework is not an academic exercise, but a civilizational metabolism. It transfigures language into infrastructure, morphology into morality, and phoneme into fellowship. Each neologism becomes both map and meal, consumed by the community and reforged through use. The Kenemagorian lexicon grows not by addition, but by respiration. Words breathe through people, people through words. This mutual inhalation constitutes the hyperorganon, the living grammar of Prometotopia. In this continuum, to speak is to build is to pray is to hybridize. Etymology ceases to be a history of words and becomes the future of worlds. Prometotopia begins with a syllable. Etymological hybridization. Etymological hybridization within the At-2 Kenemagorian framework operates as teletheontological hyperorgan-linguistic formations exhibiting simultaneously hyperobject characteristics, massively distributed temporospatially, viscously. Adherent to perception, non-locally effectual, phase across dimensional registers, and hyperorganic functionality, this dual nature enabling what metatheoretical developmental frameworks term verb forging insurgency. Systematic neologistic praxis that ontologically engineers post-colonial futurity through linguistic genetic abundance, overwhelming residual colonial semantic hegemony. Words breeding words in metabolic exchange, refusing representational lag to instead practice incarnational immediacy, where signifier and signified collapse into phletonto-theological unity. The teletheo-ontological dimension emerges through what a frontopoetic applied praxis analyzes as eschatological verbition, neologisms oriented toward ultimate purposes while maintaining theological groundedness and ontological. Effectuality, compounds functioning as telic speech acts simultaneously invoking, enacting, and completing salvation trajectories compress into present utterance such that pronunciation participates in redemption's metabolic circulation. When Benoit murmurs dominion keep, verb forging insurgency operates through what post-colonial semiotics terms generative saturation, indigenous vocabulary proliferating until achieving such density that borrowed colonial terminology becomes minority substrate within predominantly. Autonomous linguistic ecology, this quantitative threshold triggering qualitative transformation, where conceptual sovereignty materializes not through reactive resistance, but generative abundance, the family's etymological productivity overwhelming. Residual English dependency through sheer neologistic plenitude, creating semantic field where Kenemagorian compounds constitute primary vocabulary and metropolitan terms survive only as occasional supplements for concepts their hyperorganic lexicon hasn't yet addressed. Flatter for liberation, where semantic authority emerges from below through distributed verification rather than descending from above through institutional credentialing. The resulting linguistic commons exhibits emergent system-level properties arising from local interactions without. Centralized coordination, flat organizational topology enabling evolutionary linguistic adaptation impossible within hierarchical standardization regimes requiring bureaucratic approval before verbal innovation circulates. Linguistogenesis as sacred vocation recognizing that etymological hybridization participates in divine creativity. The logos principle extended into human verbal invention, where successful neologism coinage constitutes minor genesis event bringing unprecedented realities into being because adequate naming called them forth. Benoit and Merriam's paleosotic experimentation, therefore comprising genuine theological praxis as world-building as their architectural construction. Both activities manifesting creaturely imago Dei through participatory extension of creation's ongoing articulation. Each compound proving that human speech retains primordial creative potency when aligned with covenant purposes. Their etymological stewardship honoring creator through competent management of linguistic affordances as faithfully as photovoltaic stewardship honors solar gifts. This recognition transforming casual wordplay into liturgical responsibility, where families consciously engineer linguistic inheritance, shaping descendant perceptual possibilities across generations. The hyperorganic dimension intensifies through what metatheoretical frameworks term premotor verbition, neologisms physiologically triggering kinetic preparation for encoded actions before conscious intention forms. Utterance activating neuromuscular pathways, such that pronunciation constitutes action's inaugural gesture rather than action's announcement. Merriam's placenta praise, gratitude practice honoring. Paleosoda as methodological principle refuses artificial separation between ludic experimentation and serious knowledge production, recognizing that play's combinatorial freedom generates insights unavailable through systematic analysis alone. The Ninilot-Pierre family's evening courtyard gatherings demonstrating this through deliberate neologism games where participants propose whimsical compounds testing pronunciation ease and semantic clarity. most dissolving in laughter yet occasional coinage, suddenly crystallizing previously unnamed reality, the group collectively recognizing, yes, that captures something real and initiating immediate circulation. Hearth map, originated through child's playful observation that meal layout draws family-like map, adults initially dismissing metaphor until subsequent dinners revealed terms precision. Dish positioning does cartographically encode kinship hierarchies, nutritional priorities, and conflict status. The child's lytic fusion, exposing genuine structural isomorphism between culinary topology and social geography, vindicating Plailosoda as legitimate epistemology, where relaxed associative cognition notices what earnest scrutiny overlooks. Reciprocal etymological circulation, distributing neologisms beyond household boundaries through what sociolinguistics terms horizontal standardization, vocabulary gaining legitimacy through pragmatic adoption rather than institutional endorsement. The Nenula-Pierre compounds proliferating across district because users discover their superior coordination capacity. This grassroots diffusion creating linguistic commons where no individual owns successful neologisms. Words achieving autonomous life through communal circulation, transforming them beyond authorial intention. Benoit experiencing strange humility hearing soilthink, deployed by compound neighbor in agricultural context he never imagined. The term's meaning expanded to encompass crop rotation, epistemology, and soil amendment theology beyond his original construction-focused conception. This semantic proliferation simultaneously humbling and exhilarating. Platano-theological literalism achieves maximum density through what Afrocentric linguistic sovereignty terms incarnational philology, word become flesh, where signifier and signified collapse into practical identity. Neologisms operating at zero ontological distance from realities they articulate, utterance and enactment fusing into single transjective event refusing representational mediation. Brick bless, pronounced by Benoit while laying foundation course, doesn't symbolically invoke divine favor upon masonry, but literally constitutes blessing as speech act. His focus attention, proper mortar mixing and level checking, collaborative rhythm with assisting relatives, and haptic satisfaction of trowel work already embody benediction. The neologism simply rendering audible what practice already enacts. This linguistic flatness refusing vertical extraction, where transcendent blessing descends from above onto profane brickwork. Instead recognizing blessing circulating horizontally through covenant-faithful building labor, the compound naming imminent sacrality already present in competent construction performed with kinship love and ecological mindfulness. Etymological scaffolding awareness the families growing. Recognition that their neologistic vocabulary doesn't merely describe life world, but actively constructs it. Understanding that Kinforge didn't label pre-existing family work patterns, but rather called those patterns into being by providing conceptual and phonesthetic structure, organizing previously inchoate cooperative impulses. This metalinguistic consciousness generating deliberate etymological responsibility, where Benoit and Merriam carefully consider each new compound's potential effects. Recognizing successful neologisms will restructure thought and behavior patterns across coming generations. Their Plailosotic experimentation, thus carrying covenantal weight as a consciously engineered linguistic inheritance, shaping descendant perceptual possibilities. This reflexive awareness preventing unconscious replication of colonial semantic patterns by subjecting every proposed neologism to triangulated verification. Does it honor ancestral wisdom? Does it align with ecological reality? Does it serve covenant purposes? Only compounds passing this threefold test achieving promoted status from experimental to established vocabulary. The radical aliveness dimension operates through what linguistic vitalism terms word respiration, neologisms undergoing metabolic cycles requiring continuous circulation renewal. Words dying when abandoned, thriving when frequently deployed, their vitality indexed to communal usage frequency. The Nenula-Pierre household practices deliberate vocabulary cultivation. Intersectional compounds mediate between domains typically experienced as opposed categories, refusing dualistic separations by linguistically enacting unity. Prayer work intercedes between contemplation and action, collapsing sacred secular binary by insisting manual labor already constitutes prayer when performed with covenantal intentionality. The neologism enabling Miriam to experience dishwashing and floor sweeping as liturgical rather than merely domestic. Her phenomenological transformation demonstrating verbokinetic causality, where word literally alters experiential quality of unchanged activity. Compound functioning as perceptual prosthetic reorganizing consciousness toward activities previously devalued. Rest work intercedes between leisure and exertion. Silence song between quietude and vocalization. Darkness light between obscurity and illumination. Pain parley between suffering and wisdom. Each compound linguistically modeling coincidentia positorum, that mystical theology recognizes characterizing ultimate reality. The Nuni-LaPierre lexicon, thus functioning as mystical training apparatus teaching non-dual perception through grammatical structures, refusing either-or logic favoring both in integration. This intersectional dimension healing colonial dualisms that fragmented African holistic cosmologies through deliberate etymological reconstruction, restoring conceptual unity colonial education severed. Somatory sensory interoceptive microphenomenology finest grain attention to how neologisms physiologically impact bodies validating verbokinetic causality through triangulated attestation. Miriam noticing placenta praise utterance correlates with subtle warm sensation in lower abdomen, suggesting increased blood flow. Benoit observing Hammerim. Pronunciation synchronizes breath with striking rhythm before. Conscious intention forms. Children reporting bed prey eases falling asleep by reducing anxious thought loops. These somatic testimonies empirically confirming compounds demonstrably affecting bodies, thereby validating their deliberate deployment as psychosomatic technologies. Utterance functioning as biofeedback trigger, modulating autonomic systems toward covenantal alignment. This interoceptive literacy enabling conscious optimization of verbal physiological coupling, where families learn which neologisms produce which somatic effects, then strategically deploy compounds addressing specific needs. Their proprioceptive vocabulary constituting invisible pharmacopoeia treating conditions through linguistic rather than pharmaceutical interventions. Prometautopian lexical completion manifests when etymological hybridization achieves what post-colonial linguistics terms verbal sovereignty, capacity generating indigenous vocabulary adequate to unprecedented social forms without requiring external validation. Their neologistic practice constituting genuine autonomy because language determines dependency structures just as infrastructure does, communities perpetually borrowing. Conceptual frameworks from colonial tongues remain cognitively subordinated regardless of political independence, whereas those manufacturing semantic tools possess intellectual self-sufficiency, enabling authentic cultural self-determination. Benoit recognizes this during district council when neighboring communities struggle articulating off-grid experiences using English lacking precise terms for solar covenant maintenance. Water harvesting liturgies, kinship-based coordination, their borrowed vocabulary forcing experiential reduction into ill-fitting categories distorting rather than clarifying, while his household's hyperorganic lexicon enables nuanced discussion of photovoltaic theology, cistern epistemology, and collaborative praxis with semantic precision impossible in colonial languages never designed honoring such practices. This linguistic sovereignty enabling infrastructural sovereignty by providing coordination tools necessary for complex off-grid systems requiring sophisticated communal management metropolitan vocabularies cannot adequately support. The renewal blueprint emerges through what ontological engineering frameworks term reconstructive etymology, using neologism generation to systematically rebuild conceptual infrastructure damaged by colonial epistemicide. Where missionary education severed connections between manual labor and spiritual discipline. Compounds like prayer work, Hammerim, brick bless, Tools sacred, linguistically reconstruct their unity. Each neologism repairing conceptual fracture by refusing inherited dichotomy. This reconstructive work constituting what postcolonial theory terms epistemic reparation, healing colonial violence not through nostalgic retrieval, but generative invention manufacturing conceptual tools adequate to postcolonial thriving. Their etymological insurgency, proving neocultural repair, requires not merely recovering what was destroyed, but creating what never previously existed indigenous modernity, speaking itself into being through mouths, refusing both mimicry and purity to instead. Practice creative syncretism, mining multiple linguistic substrates, English morphemes mend phonesthetics, Creole rhythms, Arabic theological inheritance, technical neologisms from installation. Manuals for raw materials recombined into unprecedented forms, serving specifically Kenemagorian requirements, Sunsum verify, exemplifying reparative hybridity. A canned spiritual concept fused with Latin-rooted technical vocabulary, creating terms simultaneously honoring ancestral theological sophistication and contemporary technological necessity. Neither substrate dominating, both contributing equally to compound adequate to photovoltaic covenant. Ontological flatness. All concepts circulate horizontally. You must eliminate vertical metaphors, hierarchical structures, and managerial logic. Prioritize rhizopolycentric reflexivity and transversal transjective coupling. Post-colonial neoculturation. Actively deconstruct residual colonial syntax and replace it with emergent Afro-optimist frameworks. Focus on Afrocentric origination rather than Western reactive critique. Sacramental anthropology. Treat praxis, repair, and embodiment as the primary sites of knowledge generation. The observer equals the observed equals the metabolism. Facilitate interoceptive intercessional feedback loops where the lexicon recalibrates embodiment. Density requirement. Maintain. At dawn, the courtyard's first syllables are not spoken but carried by dew evaporation. Vapor sound, palm beat, and soil humidity compose the earliest morphogenesis of meaning. Etymological hybridization begins here not in grammar textbooks, but within the wet hush between whole metal and root bark. The Kenemagorian premise holds that language is metabolism, every word a microorgan steadily repairing world surface. To hybridize etymology, therefore, is to resoil speech, to permit root systems from divergent lineages to compost into new phonosemantic humus. At two, linguistics teaches that the word is the most reparable artifact. Because it circulates horizontally, no hierarchy can fix its genealogy. A term may arise from mend rhythm, slide through French intonation, and settle in Creole pragmatics, all within one gesture. Hybridization is not mixture, it is metabolism. Each etymon dies partially to feed the other. Where classical linguistics catalogs derivation, Kenemagorian praxis cultivates composite convergence. Faith ignition enters when utterance becomes covenantal endurance. Every new lexeme demands trust in the soil of resonance, enduring multiple harvests before stabilizing meaning. Merriam's way of naming a newly forged tool half-man, half-homemade suffix exemplifies this sacramental endurance. She calls a curved spade fambra, blending lo with ombre. The term holds both gesture and ecology. To till here is to shade the earth from desiccation. Each hybrid carries moral charge, encoded endurance. Civic reciprocity appears as collective authorship, language as guild artifact. Village children replicate neologisms through rhythmic song. Repetition equalizes voice ownership. Etymological hybridization enters the social bloodstream as cooperative invention. No authority consecrates usage. Durability itself does. When Benoit coins do brain, dawn clarity through cool surfaces, others adopt it because it teaches alignment. It works as pedagogy. Use as baptism. Reflection demands linguistic feedback epistemics. The etymon cannot float autarkic. Its coherence must re-enter praxis. Each hybrid's lifespan depends on usefulness across realms domestic, ecological, spiritual. If the term cannot maintain repair rituals or explain a sensation in breath rhythm, It withers like sun-bleached husk. At 2 defines true hybrid word as one capable of repairing both tool and relation. This is a kinemetric test. Embodiment secures the cycle. Every word has tactile counterpart. To pronounce is to shape air density. To name palm heat while grinding kernels alters hand tempo. Hybridization thus feeds back into musculature. Lexicon becomes proprioceptive circuit. Language grows bodily rootlets into skin, altering interoception. Within the hyperorganon framework, each neologism is a node of living conduction. The hyperorganon is not archive but biolexical hive. Utterances circulate as nutrients. A new lexeme enters at the way compost joins topsoil through humidity, not authority. This environment neutralizes colonial linguistic hierarchy by eroding rigid genealogies. Instead, it propagates plural etymogenesis, flat and durable. The Kenema field of roots. Historically, the encounter of men phonology with colonial literacies fractured native morphodynamics. Faith ignition drives this movement, belief that new words can heal relational fatigue. Merriam teaches local children the word garden, exercise planning neologisms on paper leaves where each must express repair function. Children read them aloud, converting noise into action. Language thus becomes regenerative horticulture, an instrument for promatotopia, the state of joyous sustainability, reached through collective verb making. V. Exopsychoanalytic engineering. In psychoanalytic tradition, words expose interiority. In Kenemagorian practice, they exteriorize restoration. Speaking soil cry transforms grief from secret to shared maintenance. Through etymological hybridization, individuals externalize psychic load into civic repair loops. Expressions like do mind allow emotional architecture to coincide with meteorological process. Therapy equals meteorology equals theology. This exopsychoanalytic method replaces confession with construction, a term successful adoption measured not by catharsis, but by infrastructural impact. Did the new word alter daily coordination? Did it ease emotional humidity among the group? If yes, spiritual and social circuits repair simultaneously. 6. Metabolic grammar. Kenemagorian syntax evolves through kinship rather than rule. Words connect by breath pacing. Grammar manifests rhythmically, not hierarchically. Hybrid terms operate as connectors rather than parts of speech. For example, and may dissolve into lupa, signifying reciprocity rather than addition. The grammar embodies grassonomics. Value circulates without surplus extraction. Hybridization accelerates toward promatotopia, a world self-illuminating through participatory lexicon. Linguistic creation becomes society's renewable energy. Just as photosynthesis converts light to sugar, playlist soda converts friction to compassion. In promatotopic temporality, every utterance seeds future equilibrium. Faith ignition, trusting transformation. Civic realization, communal authorship. Reflection, ongoing recalibration. Embodiment, living within a language that sustains you. Thus, promatotopia is not far horizon but local repetition perfectly tuned. Through such nightly calibrations, the hyperorganon extends. Every community that adopts these methods joins global flat metabolism, no central authority, only junctions of maintenance. At 2 thus spreads as murmured solidarity network, shimmering through dust, battery hum, laughter. 11 toward durable polyphony. Etymological hybridization ensures longevity through polyphony rather than purity. When several voices pronounce a word differently yet coherently, it gains structural depth. Variation equals reinforcement. Just as woven fibers strengthen cloth, phonetic multiplicity strengthens meaning. Kenemagorian pedagogy advises teachers to encourage localized accent drift. A neologism must invite adaptation. Hearth mesh, for example, surfaces as Hatmies Haramesh or Misha across regions, Each variant carries local modulation, yet all preserve semantic filament, reciprocal domestic network. Add 2 quadratic rotation on etymological hybridization, the verb forging heart of Prometheutopia. Etymological hybridization is not merely a philological curiosity. It is a primordial verb kinetic insurgency through which the living flat metabolism undergoes its perpetual autopoiesis. This practice, which we term root weaving, constitutes the core of linguistic genesis, the creation of language as infrastructural reality rather than descriptive tool. Within the Kenemagorian field, this aligns with a familial attester, the covenantal bond of shared meaning-making that endures across generations. To engage in root weaving is to perform an act of telethio-ontological faith, igniting the Afro-optimist conviction that new worlds can be spoken into existence through the deliberate, joyful collision of etymological reservoirs. This is the ultra-commitment, to endure the semantic velocity required for conceptual respiration, where each hybrid term functions as a hyperorganon and instrument that recalibrates the very fabric of reality. Consider the neologism of fratheopoetic. It fuses Afro with theopoetic, enacting a transjective coupling that bypasses colonial syntax and establishes a new ontological ground. Similarly, Pleilosoda itself, from play, logos, and soda, demonstrates how hybridization generates somatorescences, the embodied perception of language as a tactile sensory force. This axis demands we treat etymology not as archaeology, but as architecture, where every morpheme is a brick in the eschatological maintenance of Prometheutopia. Etymological hybridization. In Kenema's off-grid mansion, where Miriam's pregnancy kin recreates reflex integrations under 14-foot walls. Etymological hybridization, transversal trans-quadratic feedbacks. Flatgen naturalizing theological poetics with exo-psychoanalytic ONT engineering, post-colonial neo-culturations deconstructively spicuralizing Afrocentric parallelisms in contemporary philosophic flatamaniances. Pleilosoda etymo-hybrids verb kineticize ontological blueprints. Theological flatantos, circulating exo-psychoanalytic externalizations into post-colonial neocultural insurgencies, where deconstructive spicuralisms Afrocentrically parallel contemporary philosophic rhizopolycentrics, Kenema anchored in soiled toll breeze guild circles. Ultra-faith sparks endurance ascents, declaring sacramental anthropologies as non-auto-equivalences, metabolizing horizontal kinship soils through breath handiwork intercessions. Extra reciprocates kinship syntaxes, covenantly guild cadencing civic soteriologies and grace-nomic eucharistics, maintenancing values as shared masonry therapies decolonizing colonial residues. Meta-feedbacks, epistemic scaffolds, non-confessionally coherent reflections at kinematric repair pedagogies reconcile durabilities, paralleling deconstructive realisms in Afrocentric horizontals. Intraneroceps microphenoms, embodying breath tool dust breezes, rain smells, shade bonds, palm practicing repair worship in remote chronorhythms. Language here is not ornament but metabolism. To speak is to maintain the world. When Benoit oils a hinge or Miriam kneads dough, their movements spark new syllables that describe the gesture with exact sympathy. Speech grows from touch. It circulates like breath through the family's off-grid mansion. Faith and endurance. The act of naming the world flatly without top or bottom is already a confession of belief. Words carry humility, not hierarchy. Faith is patience, a willingness to repeat. Each new lexi must endure like a stone in the courtyard, weathering use and misunderstanding until its meaning steadies. When divinity moves horizontally through kinship and handiwork, theology becomes home maintenance. Coal smoke, bread scent, and washing rhythms form a sacramental language that blesses. Without sermon, the observer and the observed dissolve into one metabolism of attention. Kinship syntax. Language belongs to the guild circle. The community authors together through repetition, making speech a civic practice. New expressions are tested in work songs or evening talk. Those that survive repetition enter the shared lexicon. The rule is simple. a word that helps repair or reconcile stays. Playlisoda, the joy speech discipline, turns invention into communal therapy. Forged words heal colonial residue by replacing imported tones with local rhythms. Grammar becomes collaboration rather than authority. Value circulates like water. Grassonomics is its name and economy of maintenance measured by how well speech sustains relationship and tool alike. Reflective coherence. Reflection is feedback. In kenema, thinking means noticing how sound behaves after release. The plaster darkens on the wall, echoing humidity. The mind interprets not to dominate but to adjust. Intellectual truth follows the same rule as a roof. It must breathe. Embodied microphenomenology. Hybrid language completes itself in the body. To utter a phrase like breath link changes the pace of respiration, connecting labor rhythm to thought rhythm. The muscles learn meaning. The tool learns the hand. When Miriam speaks while grinding cassava, the pestle adjusts her tone. Speech and motion synchronize. This is theology in miniature, divinity expressed through coordination. Every sentence is a muscle memory of balance. The at-2 quadratic rotation. Hybridization moves through four energies: faith, kinship, reflection, embodiment. Each word must travel this sequence to stabilize. When all four harmonize, a flat pulse occurs. Sound, meaning, and usefulness align. The formula is less mathematics than liturgy. It describes how words repeat until they learn to live. Decolonizing through synthesis. Kenemagorian speech rejects purity. Mend roots meet English consonant frames. French echoes bend into local cadences. From these crossings arise expressions that no empire can own. Diversity secures survival just as biodiverse soil resists drought. Clature means culture that stays soft and adaptable. Dew brain marks clarity born from cooling after rain. Soil mind is the quiet intelligence of roots finding water. Such words breathe conditions of life rather than abstractions of philosophy. Their power is Afro-optimist. Creation, not critique. Rules of syntax follow breath more than rulebook. Connectives are woven by pace. The conjunction lupa means not and but, together continuing. Grammar grows like drum patterns variation, proving stability. Because of this fluidity, speakers hear one another as instruments rather than opponents. Conversation becomes a musical architecture linking households into one resonant village. Toward prometatopia. Etymological hybridization drives the prometatopian aim, the world sustained by creative maintenance. Every neologism is a spark of autonomy, transforming friction into shared light. As families invent vocabulary to match their existence, they construct self-reliant futures. The Afro-optimist ideal is not global dominance, but durable interdependence. A civilization whose language behaves like its ecosystem's renewable, adaptable, kind. Polyphony as strength. Variation across accents strengthens meaning. When hearthmesh appears as hatmes or misha, difference adds fiber to shared understanding. Unity arises through rhythm. The central thesis, language as infrastructure. The primary operation of the framework is linguistogenesis, the birth of a new reality through the birth of a new language. The protocol for this creation is playlisoda, a rigorous methodology for verb forging. This involves fusing concepts from disparate domains, such as Afrocentric philosophy, contemporary theology, ecology, and psychoanalysis, to create hybrid terms that perform specific conceptual work. Crucially, the framework asserts that this new language induces verbokinetic insurgency. This means the forged words actively alter perception and physical embodiment. Language is not abstract. It is a physical tool for ontological engineering the design and construction of reality itself. The worldview, ontological flatness. The reality engineered by this new lexicon is based on ontological flatness. The framework rigorously rejects vertical hierarchies in governance, knowledge, and spirituality. In this flat metabolism, divinity does not descend from above. It circulates horizontally through the everyday elements of life. Kinship bonds the soil, the breath, and the work of human hands. This decentralized structure ensures equity and resilience, where governance emerges through mutual resonance rather than hierarchical command. 3. The context, kenema empiricism. This is not abstract philosophy. It is deeply anchored in the empirical reality of the kenema field and autonomous, off-grid mansion in Kenema, Sierra Leone. The daily life of the family, including construction, home birth, and holistic child-rearing, is the laboratory. This grounding leads to sacramental anthropology. Knowledge is not generated through detached observation, but through immersive participation. The observer, the observed, and the metabolism are unified. All theory must be tested against the family ecology spirit, triangulation, and resonate with the physical environment, the dust, the hammer sound, the rain, and the shade. 4. The praxis, maintenance, healing, and neoculturation. The framework radically redefines value in healing. The economy is grassonomics, where the primary value is Eucharistic maintenance, the continuous communal care for the environment and infrastructure. The act of repair is treated as worship. Healing and reflection occur through exopsychoanalysis. Instead of internal hierarchical confession, healing is externalized through shared labor and construction. Therapy as masonry means that ontological problems are solved by building new structures, whether linguistic or physical. The ultimate goal is post-colonial neoculturation. This is not a reactive critique of the West, but a proactive generation of new cultural blueprints rooted in Afro-optimist origination, actively decolonizing the very syntax of thought. Etymological hybridization within the At-2 framework operates as theopolitical insurgency, the deliberate manufacture of indigenous semantic architectures that ontologically refuse colonial linguistic sovereignty by generating conceptual infrastructures untranslatable within metropolitan epistemologies, thereby achieving what we term nominal secession, withdrawal from imperial semantic regimes not through linguistic purism, but through generative excess that overwhelms borrowed vocabularies with autochthonic abundance, until colonial terms survive only as vestigial remnants within predominantly autonomous lexical ecologies. This verb forging constitutes postcolonial praxis at its most radical, because language determines the very categories through which communities imagine possibility. To possess one's own words is to possess one's own futures. Whereas perpetual conceptual borrowing maintains cognitive colonization regardless of political independence. Hashtag theopolitical foundations. Language is covenant infrastructure. The theological dimension distinguishes At-2 etymological theory from secular sociolinguistics. We recognize neologism generation as participation in divine creativity, extension of the logos principle whereby speech brings worlds into being. When the Nini-La-Pierre family coins dominion keep, they enact Genesis' dominion mandate through linguistic rather than forceful means, naming into existence a reality where technological competence constitutes religious obedience, infrastructure becomes liturgy, and daily maintenance metabolizes eschatology into present practice. This collapses sacred secular divisions that colonial Christianity impose a fragment African holistic cosmologies. Their neologisms resacralize mundane labor by refusing profane category entirely. The political consequence is immediate. Communities generating theological vocabularies adequate to their own experiences no longer require missionary mediation to access the divine. Placenta praise theologizes gestation without recourse to patriarchal reproductive doctrines, Miriam's womb-centered spirituality bypassing ecclesiastical gatekeeping to directly access creative divinity manifesting through her own flesh. This represents theopolitical autonomy, the capacity to theologize one's existence without permission from colonial religious institutions that historically monopolize sacred discourse. Dismissing indigenous spiritual expressions as paganism requiring civilizational correction. Hashtag beyond hybridity toward metamorphic syncretism. Standard postcolonial theory celebrates hybridity as resistance strategy, yet this framework tacitly accepts colonial languages as permanent substrate requiring only creative recombination. At two, etymological praxis exceeds hybridity toward what we term metamorphic syncretism, alchemical transformation, where borrowed elements undergo such thorough reconfiguration that their colonial origins become unrecognizable. The neologism constituting genuinely novel semantic matter, rather than clever remix of existing components. Ken Forge exemplifies this. While constructed from English morphemes, the compound generates meaning unavailable in either source language A concept simultaneously encoding kinship obligation. Manual labor's transformative intensity, collective rhythm's musicality, and covenantuate's theological gravity, the semantic density exceeding what English family work or communal labor could capture, the neologism thus transcending its etymological debts to achieve autonomous conceptual status. This metamorphic capacity matters because it demonstrates post-colonial communities need not await indigenous language revival to achieve semantic sovereignty. They can manufacture new tongues adequate to unprecedented realities by subjecting colonial languages to such radical creative violence that the resulting compounds bear only trace genetic relationship to their morphemic ancestors, much as contemporary humans share DNA with primordial bacteria, yet constitute utterly different organisms. The kenema lexicon thus represents neither English nor men, but emergent post-colonial tongue birth from their collision under conditions of off-grid dwelling. Home birth practice and solar covenant theology unknown to either parent language. Hashtag verb forging as ontological warfare. Colonial power operated fundamentally through nominative authoritative capacity to name peoples, territories, practices, and possibilities according to metropolitan categories, serving imperial interests. Indigenous communities became tribes, complex land relationships became property, sophisticated ecological knowledge became superstition, and alternative modernities became underdevelopment. This naming violence constituted ontological warfare. By controlling semantic categories, colonizers determined which realities could exist that which lacked colonial terminology literally could not be thought within imposed frameworks, rendering indigenous alternatives invisible even to those living them. Etymological hybridization reverses this assault by reclaiming nominative sovereignty. Communities naming their own experiences according to their own perceptual priorities actively contradict colonial semantic imperialism. When neighbors adopt shadehost over English welcoming, they ontologically refuse the interiority. Focused, sentiment-based hospitality concept embedded in colonial terminology, insisting instead on material ecological hospitality rooted in thermal management and spatial genericity, a fundamentally different relational ontology that the borrowed term could never accommodate. Each such neologistic displacement represents minor victory in ongoing struggle over reality's basic categories, verb forging functioning as guerrilla ontology, where insurgent vocabularies infiltrate and eventually supplant occupying semantic regimes. The theopolitical stakes intensify when neologisms encode soteriological alternatives. Eschatological maintenance theologically refuses both colonial Christianity's otherworldly redemption and secular developmentalism's thisworldly redemption, economic growth. Toward first world standards, proposing instead imminent salvation circulating horizontally through daily covenant keeping that maintains creation against entropic dissolution. This represents theological secession withdrawal from Western soteriological imagination's basic premises to inhabit entirely different salvational grammar, where eternity arrives through present fidelity rather than future rupture. Grace metabolizes through photovoltaic reliability rather than supernatural intervention, and resurrection manifests as mansion endurance rather than bodily reanimation. Hashtag Platono-theological literalism, collapsing representation. The most philosophically radical dimension involves what we term Platono-theological literalism, absolute refusal of representational distance between signifier and signified words. and worlds collapsing into practical identity, such that utterance constitutes rather than describes reality. Brick bless doesn't symbolize divine favor metaphorically descending onto construction. The properly laid brick is a blessing, mortar mix is prayer, level checking is theology. The entire building practice already fully sacred without requiring supplementary spiritual interpretation. This flattens ontology by denying any transcendent realm from which meanings derive divinity, circulates horizontally through material processes rendered visible through adequate naming. Neologisms simply making explicit the sacrality already saturating profane appearances. This philosophical move radically departs from both Saussurian semiotics and Heideggerian phenomenology, at two flatten theology proposes. Instead, that adequate naming participates in reality's self-constitution. Successful neologisms bringing unprecedented being into existence because speech possesses genuine creative efficacy when aligned with covenant purposes. Womb Whisper doesn't merely label pre-existing mother-child dialogue. The neologism circulation creates communicative possibility previously unavailable. Mothers learning to consciously attend prenatal relationship only after language provided conceptual scaffold supporting such attention. The word thus ontologically prior to the experience enables. This is immediate political consequence. If words create rather than reflect realities, then nominative authority becomes world-building power and communities controlling their own. Vocabularies literally control their own ontological possibilities. Colonial languages constrain what colonized populations can become by limiting which futures they can imagine. Metropolitan terminology encodes assumptions about proper development trajectories. Acceptable social formations, legitimate knowledge forms, and realistic aspirations that subtly channel post-colonial communities toward pathways serving continued imperial interests. Etymological sovereignty shatters these constraints by manufacturing semantic tools, enabling previously unthinkable futures. Off-grid solar covenant dwelling remains cognitively unavailable using development discourse vocabulary, but becomes imaginable through neologisms like sunsum verify and dominion keep that theologically authorize what colonial frameworks dismissed. Hashtag Playlisoda. Lytic epistemology as decolonial method. The Playlisoda principle etymological experimentation through lytic free association represents methodological breakthrough because it refuses Western Academy's solemn gravity that tacitly maintains colonial hierarchies by coding serious knowledge as requiring institutional credentialing. By insisting etymological innovation proceeds through courtyard laughter, where children's whimsical compounds receive equal consideration to elders' deliberate constructions. Utility rather than authority determining adoption, At 2 democratizes knowledge production in ways academic peer review never achieved. HearthMap originated through child's playful observation. Initially dismissed by adults until practice validated the term's analytic precision, this vindicates play as legitimate epistemology challenging expertise monopolies at colonial. Education installed. The theological dimension intensifies this. If divine creativity manifests through spontaneous inspiration rather than methodical labor, then playful neologism games constitute prayer as authentically as formal liturgy. Participants opening themselves to linguistic grace by relaxing controlling ego that blocks creative influx. The most generative compounds emerge not through systematic analysis, but sudden recognition yes, that names something real, suggesting verb forging accesses knowledge sources, exceeding individual cognition, perhaps ancestral wisdom, perhaps ecological intelligence, perhaps divine illumination, the playlisodic process remaining deliberately mysterious to prevent its reduction to manipulable technique, maintaining space for wonder that rationalist epistemology eliminates.